And my name's Chris Williams, and I kind of have two hats. One is as a Green Party activist, and I also helped the Green Party when it was standing Police and Crime Commissioner candidates at the last elections. My other hat is as a historian of crime and policing, and I look particularly at policing in the 20th century, but also contemporary police issues, including deaths after police contact. And I'm with an organisation called History and Policy, helped convene a seminar at the Home Office to tell Home Office civil servants how to do their job better. There are there's things that I accept, just to get them on the table. We need police. Some people have got to look after the monopoly of force in society, and having a small number of coppers who are routinely armed, and that's their job, is a very good way of doing that. If you have more coppers with guns, they're not going to be so well trained. The guns will be smaller, easier to draw. The barriers to action will be lower. This is what we see with tasers and CS. When you have a non-lethal alternative, what basically happens is it gets used more, not less. So I'm not bothered about coppers being armed with guns. I'm not bothered about coppers being armed with carbines. And I think the way we tend to do it, i.e. they're somewhere in a car, somewhere within a quarter of an hour's drive of here, is a reasonably good way. Assuming that it's good to have two coppers in a car with carbines somewhere near Leicester at any one time. When then is it good for them to be out the car, walking around, and where? It seems to me that there are some good reasons for getting out the car. You need to stretch your legs, you need to practice getting in and out of the car. So if you need to do it, you'll need to know how to do that sort of thing. You can't just stay in the car. You also need to sort of know how big Vicky Park is, to walk around occasionally to see, how big Leicester Market is and where the entrances and exits are. There are reasons for, occasionally, our coppers with guns to be getting out of the car, walking around for a bit and getting back in the car. Those are good reasons. There are other reasons, though, because although I can set up this idea of an accountable, reasonably well-run police force, which is rational and is always doing good and is always obeying the law, that has not been the case in this country for the last 30 years, for some of the time, at least, in some places at least. So we've seen today that the coppers who failed to look after Sean Regan, it was proved they failed to look after him, they lied about it to the IPCC, and Sean Regan died, this is exactly 10 years ago, are not going to face any charges. So we don't live in a country where everybody looks at the police and sees a helper and a friend. There are lots of people who have very good reason for looking at police and not seeing helpers and friends. So the act of getting out of the car and walking around the landscape with a carbine there are good reasons for it sometimes, but it's going to be read by a lot of people, not by no means a majority, but a significant minority, as intimidatory. And so I think I would like to start from there and to say we need to discuss what are the times and places it's good for the police to be around the corner parked up, and what are the times and places it's good for them to be out of the car. But I think personally I would say we have to take into account the fact that walking around with big guns, while it reassures some people, does not reassure other people, and I think that's where our debate needs to start. So I'll set that one up for you.
So I'm Mathew Hulbert. I was a Lib Dem councillor over in Hinckley and Bosworth from 2011 to 2015. I remain actively involved in the party through thick and through thin, and we've had quite a lot of thin of late. I wasn't a massive fan of everything that the coalition government did. It did some good things. Equal marriage and pupil premium, but some of it I quite vocally opposed. So I guess what I'd call myself is kind of a left, centre-left Lib Dem, which sometimes one of my party colleagues is here. It sometimes gets me in trouble in the party, but we're a democratic party, so everyone has a voice. Firstly, can I say that it's a great honour to once again be taking part in this year's Leicester Human Rights Arts and Film Festival, and I'd like to thank Ambrose for inviting me to do so. My apologies that I've not been particularly well, and I'm not hearing very much at all, so quite how much I'll be able to participate in the actual debate side of it, we'll see, but I can certainly make this opening statement, and I'm happy to do so. With the election of Donald Trump in the United States and with impending Brexit here, there's perhaps never been a more important time to reaffirm the human rights of every single human being and our defiance in the face of any attempt to diminish those human rights. The chief responsibility of any government is to keep people safe, and in a civilised and organised society, one of the ways that we do that is, of course, by having a police force who enforce the law of the land. Now, no human institution is perfect, and there will always be issues with the police, things that could be done better and handled better. But I do think it's important to say in such a debate that I have great admiration for the police and indeed all our emergency services. They run towards incidents which the rest of us rightly and understandably run away from. And they are in many ways the best of us. Now, I'm a Liberal, and it's the historic role of Liberals and Liberal Democrats, I believe at least, to be a bulwark against an overweening state, against a surveillance state, against a police state. The preamble to the Liberal Democrats' constitution states that the Liberal Democrats exist to build and safeguard a free, fair and open society in which we seek to balance the fundamental values of liberty, equality and community, and in which no one shall be enslaved by poverty, ignorance or conformity. It goes on to say that we champion the freedom, dignity and well-being of individuals. We acknowledge and respect their right to freedom of conscience and their right to develop their talents to the full. We aim to disperse power, to foster diversity and to nurture creativity. We believe that the role of the state is to enable all citizens to attain these ideals, to contribute fully to their communities and to take part in the decisions which affect their lives. Now, our manifesto commitment, had we been in government, not very likely this time round, but still, we obviously had to have a manifesto, was to invest an extra £300 million a year in the police to help combat the rising crime, particularly in violent crime, since 2015. We'd require all frontline officers to wear body-worn cameras on duty, protecting the public from abuse of power and protecting police officers from malicious accusations. Police forces need extra resources. We've seen, I think it's about 20,000 cut since 2010. Of course, my party has to take some of the blame for that. We were in coalition government, and as pertain this particular debate, between 2010 and 2016, 19% of authorised firearms officers were cut, and that's more than 1,300. And as I say, my party has to take its share of the blame as we were in coalition government for 5 of those 6 years. In terms of armed police then, which is obviously the particular topic of this debate, it's not normal for me at these debates to say that I can see both sides of a debate. I'm normally very firm in what I believe, but for once I'm going to do the Lib Dem thing and say that I can see both sides of the argument. There's no doubt about it at all that we've seen the horrendous terrorist attacks in the UK and elsewhere this year and over recent years. And I checked with, I should point out that I'm the independent chair of the Leicestershire Police's LGBT Independent Advisory Group, and as a result of that I attend the Police Advisory Group on Equalities. And I checked with one of the police staff yesterday ahead of coming here tonight, just to check exactly what the reason is that armed police are now deployed at pretty much every public events, including here in Leicester, including Pride and carnivals, etc. And I was told that it is because the terrorism threat is what it is at the moment, which I believe is severe, meaning that a terrorist attack is imminent, and that therefore it's felt by the police. And I mean, as I say, I'm the independent chair of the LGBT IAG, so I'm not the police's representative here, but it's felt by the police that at such a time when people feel unsure and perhaps a bit afraid, especially when at big large public occasions, it's felt that to provide that reassurance armed police need to be not just there, but seen to be there. But, of course, as a Liberal, I also look at it from a civil liberties perspective, and there will undoubtedly be people in our communities for whom they're not reassured. They're very much the opposite of reassured when they see armed police deployed to events. In actual fact, it makes them feel less safe rather than more. And I think, it's for the police to be aware of that and to do its best to communicate with various different communities, minority communities and others, to say this is why we are doing this, and to have that public dialogue and to make changes if it's needed. And so I guess my personal preference would be that they're used only when they have to be used, and not at other times. But I guess the police would probably say to that at the moment, on every major public occasion, it's right that our armed police are used. I've been trying to find if in preparation for tonight, if my party has an official position on armed police. I've not been able to find one. I did see that there was some discussion by members of our Scottish Party against, this is going back 2014 though, so I don't know whether the threat level was the same as it is now, but against armed police being used at various events in Scotland. And again, I think it is from that perspective of civil liberties. But I have to say, I would personally prefer them only to be used where they have to be used, but I'm not per se against the use of armed police.
My name's Tessa Warrington. I'm the Assistant Secretary for the East Midlands region of the Socialist Party. And obviously this discussion around an increase in armed police is coming off the back of increased number of terror attacks. And so I think that's really the context that we have to have this debate in. And it's not just Leicester locally, it is a national increase, not only in armed police, but also in some instances the bringing of the military into public areas to subsidise police presence, particularly when there have been so many cutbacks to the police. And obviously for a lot of people, and the intention, I think, is to provide a comfort, a sense of security and protection. And I think in a lot of instances where you do see armed police, it is for that reason. It is for show rather than for action. And I think that has to be taken into account. But obviously, police being armed isn't a solution to terrorism. And so that has to be part of the discussion. Why people are drawn to terrorism and what is an alternative to that, rather than just looking at should police be armed or not. But I think that alongside this, the arming of police, the question is, where does it end and who has control? And if you see the increase of armed police, not just in the city centre and in public places, but in on patrol in local communities, then there is legitimately, I think, fears that with austerity, with increasing poverty, and with the crime that results from that poverty, we could see a situation akin to what has developed in America with the shooting of people from black and mixed race backgrounds as more of a common occurrence. And I think it is widely recognised the institutionalised nature of racism within the police force, not just in the US, but obviously over here particularly well known in the Met Police, but also in regional police forces as well, as was uncovered sort of over 10 years ago now in a undercover documentary into the Cheshire Police Force. And so the question is, with that police force as it exists from with the institutionalised racism that exists is that a police force that the public and the sections of society that are going to feel particularly unhappy with armed police feel comfortable with. And I think you've got to consider both those angles, both the legitimacy of people wanting to feel protected from terrorist attacks, because obviously in the short term, if somebody comes into a public space with a bomb or driving a vehicle, then fighting to end poverty and austerity and change society is not something that can be done in an instant, and police need to be able to respond effectively and quickly to those instances. But I think what the Socialist Party would put forward as an immediate step is to further democratise the police force. And there's currently little to no democracy within the police, I would say. Very, very few positions are elected. And so what we would argue for would be for more managerial positions within the local police force to be subject to election and the right to recall from the local communities, as well as the decisions such as whether to have an armed police force in local communities being the democratic decision of those communities themselves, and make sure that the police force, who at the moment are answerable to the state rather than the people, and when it is the government who are responsible for doling out austerity that creates the discord in society, then individuals and oppressed minorities are likely to be the targets of police violence rather than the system itself. And that can be seen historically in struggles like Orgreave and Hillsborough, where the police do not always act in the interest of the majority in society. And so I would say that the most immediate thing that could be done to rectify this is to make the police directly answerable to the people rather than to the state. But in the long term, I don't think the question can be separated out from the issue of austerity, of cuts for the poor majority and tax breaks for the rich. And it can't be separated out from the need to end the undemocratic and destructive capitalist system and fights for a democratically run social society which could see all communities and oppressed minorities liberated from poverty and oppression.
Hi, my name's Kirk Master. I'm here today as a ward councillor for the Labour Party here in the city. I'm the ward councillor for Stonygate, which is quite a diverse ward within the inner city area of Leicester. I'm a keen supporter of equality and championing grassroots organisations, so quite rightly fitting in the equalities building here this evening with my colleagues. I'm picking this conversation up late in the day, but it's one that I'm quite conscious of in a number of roles that I play locally and have done historically nationally, in regards to policing society, policing communities, across a range of different subject areas in truth. But in regards to the deployment of armed police officers, I guess one of the serious questions we need to ask ourselves as elected members, political parties, community groups or activists, or those that have influence, is to question the safety element around the role that policing has within our societies, and whether that's the fundamental starting point to how people perceive their safety or wish to ensure their safety within their day-to-day lives. Nobody wants to feel unsafe going to work, going to school, going to the park, going shopping, and I think it's the police's role, along with other partners, to ensure that safety is upheld. Over the period of time, terrorism has played a huge role in the way that the police have changed their business on a day-to-day basis. You know, the number of terrorist attacks this year alone has been frightening and alarming to many. It's been concerning to watch and to discuss with young people and groups that are affected by this, and all parts of society are affected by this. So the safety element would be a key point that I'd like to discuss in and around that today. And then the security aspect of it as well, which one of my colleagues mentioned, the types of measures that the police can use to keep our society safe. Is it around firearms? Is it the deployment of vehicles? Is it the type of weaponry and the training that they have? I think that's worth discussing as well in regards to what are the options and armed response. Is that the only model and method that we have available to us? And I guess the impact on communities for me is crucial as well, because the public are there to serve the people. I think Peel's principle, going back to the conception of the police, is the people are the police and the police are the people. And if that principle is still upheld today, then we have to take on board the concerns, right and wrongly, of the communities in which the police serve. I guess as well, the other impacts are the root causes as to why the police have to deploy in the way that they do, and it's been touched upon in terms of austerity and the social inequalities around education and employment and housing and crime, and the family circumstances and dynamics will all play a huge impact in people's personal circumstances, which will impact on the way that certain individuals will behave, and it will impact most certainly on the way that particular communities behave. And I think that's crucial going forward. Police are deploying at events. I think the threat levels are considered nationally, they're assessed nationally, they're derived out of intelligence that we wouldn't be privy to. And then I guess on the back of those threat levels and those assessments, they're actioned with certain procedural things that they would need to adhere to. And I think some of those are the deployment of firearms at particular events, at particular places within the city where there's huge crowds, and terrorist groups we know have trends of behaviour. And one of the latest trends is using vehicles in crowded places to go and mow innocent people down. And they're very difficult to police. They're very difficult to know when, where and how. On some of the information that I've personally picked up and spoke to community groups and individuals, and even wearing a different hat from in the policing world, the majority, and I wouldn't say all, but the large majority have been pleased to see armed responses officers at particular parts and times within the city. Not everybody, but the large majority would have been. Is it the right thing? Is it the wrong thing? I guess that's what we're here to discuss. From my own personal perspective, I would like to feel safe. I'd like to ensure that my family and my friends and my fellow citizens of the city and other parts of the country also feel safe. And if somebody was to be deterred from committing an act of terror by visually seeing a police officer armed and tooled and able to halt their action, I would want that to be the case. I would want that to be the case. I wouldn't want that terrorist act to be able to commit any harm on anybody, and if the police could do that by their deployments, then I would welcome that, but that's not for everybody. So I'm happy to discuss the points with my colleagues around the deployment of armed police officers going forward. And as I said, I don't think there's a wrong or a right, but there's many factors that we need to consider.
How much evidence have we got that really, having a copper in a particular street carrying a gun has ever prevented an act of terrorism? And I think that particularly now with the tactics being you drive a car off a busy road onto a pavement. What is going on now is reassurance policing. It's the functional equivalent of the cardboard cutout copper in the shop. And it's not necessarily, I'm not saying it shouldn't happen, but I think there should be the debate about it shouldn't be the same debate as about it might stop an attack. It isn't going to stop an attack. It isn't going to deter an attack. What worries me quite a lot is what I see as the failure of Prevent to do anything other than kind of sort of set up Islamist terrorism as the thing that all the kids want to talk about, and to sort of set up as the thing that their teachers and the government are telling them they've got to have a certain opinion about, which, certainly my son and his mates, for that it's like, if you're like a gabby 14-year-old, you want to take the mick out of that and troll it. I think prevent is actually counterproductive. And I remember when that time, when those mass arrests happened on that mosque in Highfields about 10-15 years ago, because there were a couple of Algerian terrorists there, and then afterwards there was this mass arrest of the entire mosque. And talking to a friend who was the mullah at the mosque, and there were, none of these guys were doing anything. It's actually been in the wrong place at the wrong time. What you ended up with was all this press about, Leicester, nest of terrorism, and it's almost like with anti-terrorist policing, you only need one thing to go wrong. Like John Charles de Menezes, for example. The more you've got people, the more you deploy armed police, the greater the chances that they're going to do the wrong thing. And the thing that worries me, the thing that's good about the British criminal justice system is that most of our coppers don't have guns, and the ones that do hardly ever use them. Because if there's one thing that can totally destroy the relationship between police and community, it's someone dying or someone being shot. Even if it might be someone that most people think was a bad in any way. So every time you deploy armed police, there's a slight chance that it's going to go horribly wrong. And I'd like to think that our criminal justice system was colourblind, but it isn't. It's like, if anything, the proportion of non-white people in prison, the overrepresentation in the UK is worse than in America. So I think it's really good that we've made, and this is one good thing that Leicestershire and other police forces have done, is they've managed to keep guns out. Yes, knives are shit, but they've managed to keep guns out of crime, personally owned guns, and that's really good, and keeping that would be excellent. But every time you deploy an armed copper, you've got the chances of them actually killing someone who's the wrong person, increase. And so there's this sort of tension between wanting to be seen to do something by the public, by some chunks of the public, and if that thing, like the mass raids in Highfields, is actually something that ends up making more and more people suspicious of the criminal justice system and the police. Because to be honest, in terms of defeating terrorism, it doesn't really matter what 95% of the population think. It's that kind of 5%, and particularly, and even probably like 2% of the population, are the hearts and minds we've got to win. And we are mainly winning, It's just, there's maybe 100,000 people that we've got to convince, and you only need to shoot the wrong person once, and suddenly like 20,000 of them, sign up to someone who says, I'm in favour of this thing because of the guy who got shot. Like the Stasi in 1969, they got one of their agents in a German student demo to shoot a copper. Sorry, one of their agents was a copper, to shoot a demonstrator. And that basically kicked off the entire Red Army faction. It's really kind of keeping guns and lethal force out of policing is a really, really good thing. And I think that I would be spring-loaded to only ever tell them to get out of the car when you really think it's going to make a difference, basically. And keep it under as tight a control as possible. And one other thing would be, with the deaths, I think of Azelle Rodney, possibly Mark Duggan as well, coppers going into situations in plain clothes and then suddenly whipping out guns when they're arresting criminals who are armed, and that's just like a recipe for shooting someone. And so I think that if you've got any influence at all, please tell them never to do that. Because so far I think we've quite literally dodged a few bullets, and let's keep it that way.
I'm pleased that in Leicester, I don't think they've ever. There was an event that the chief came to a couple of weeks ago here, and I think he reported back that Leicester has never deployed officers that have resulted in a firearm being used. Never, which is a really, I guess a good statistic to have for LLR. But with the deployment issues and the firearms issues, there are some dangerous people out there. There are some really nasty people out there that don't have the kind of social morals that most of society have, and have no care or concern about shooting, firing, and etc. randomly and across the piece. So do I think that sometimes you have to have force with force. And I don't mean that in the sense that if they shoot, you shoot, they shoot kind of thing. I think, if there was an element to criminality that believed that they had the upper hand over policing, it could escalate out of control. Do I agree with some of the points around the way that the deployments are issued and, the plain clothes and maybe body cam as well for firearms officers, which is being looked at now? Why would a firearms officer not want to wear a body cam to protect themselves, as well as what's going on in the circumstances of that particular situation? I support body cam being worn more broadly across some of these pieces. And the prevent point, I think prevent's been toxic for a while as a brand, and I don't think anybody would argue against that, whether you work in it, whether you're associated to it, a supporter or non-supporter, but it exists. And I think they could do a lot more and a lot better than what actually does happen. I mean, Leicester, to be fair, is one of the better products in and around the prevent sphere and what we do across LLR, and Leicester City, which is more broader than focusing, very narrowed, focused on Islamic terrorism only. We have the far right, we have other factors as well. So we have a good team in and around that look at it. But could they do more? Of course they could. Could they do better? Of course they do. Could. I think we all could. But the deployment issue, I think, is really important, not just on the lines of terrorism, but on the serious criminal elements that exist within society. And if they genuinely believe they had the upper hand, I think it'd spiral out of control. So the police have to have this ability or capability to be able to manage, maintain, deter all of those factions of that. But I don't think armed policing is the only way of doing that. I genuinely don't, but I do think it plays a part.
No, I'm with you there.
I don't think it is just a case of there are some nasty people out there who just out of nowhere decide that they're going to carry out a terrorist attack. I think the fact that we've seen a marked increase, that there is a pattern and a trend in the rise in terrorist attacks, that can be linked to the changes in people's living conditions. And I think we have to ask the question, why do people join terrorist organisations in the first place? And the fact is that it's not just people from the Middle East region joining groups like Boko Haram or ISIS. People from all over the world now are recruited to terrorist organisations or carry out acts in the name of those organisations. And I think for many people, they face a life of poverty, of unemployment and low wages. And if you have the misfortune in this society to be from a black or ethnic minority background, then alongside that you face an alienation from society as a result of your experience from Islamophobia and anti-immigration sentiment that has been whipped up by the state and by the media to scapegoat the blame for austerity and cutbacks, that it's not the ideological choice of a government and the fact that they'd rather have money cut from the public sector and bail out the banks and have no individual banker take any responsibility for that, either through the criminal justice system or through docking any form of pay or bonuses. And that mix leads to people looking for a sense of community and a sense of family and a way out of poverty elsewhere. And I think that is the mix that has led to an anger at society, a misjudged placement of that anger at the people around them, and the solution to terrorism and to this question today of armed police is, how do you prevent people from joining and getting involved in terrorist actions in the first place? Because if we could answer that question, then we wouldn't be having this debate about armed police in the first place. And so I think the long-term solution does need to be organising people in their workplaces, in their communities, and building a movement that can defeat austerity and kick out the Tories and take control of the economy for the majority of people in society, for working class people. And the unity that will be necessary for such a movement would provide a home for people who were disaffected. It would provide a way for them to channel their anger at society in a productive and positive way. And if you take Leicester as an example, if you want a successful strike over public sector pay, there's no way that you can do that without uniting people from white, Polish, Turkish, African and Asian backgrounds, because that is the population of our city, and that is the basis for the unity that we could achieve. And it's something that has been seen recently with the success of the Glenfield campaign to stop the closure of Glenfield Children's Heart Unit. That involved people from all across the city, because it's people, rank and file working class people from all across the city, from every background, that rely on those services and that want to come together to protect and defend those services. So I think long term, that is something that is absolutely necessary to undercut racism, to undercut the draw of terrorist organisations. But also, I say again, you know, cameras on police outfits and public scrutiny and impact assessments are all a necessary step towards accountability and democracy in the police force. But ultimately, you know, then it does need to be a far wider spreading out of accountability and democracy and the running of police by communities themselves.
I think it'd be unfair to hold the Tories to the coals because they're not here. But then I don't think it would be unfair to hold them, because it kind of tells you its own statement that they're not here to discuss these issues that affect the many and do little for the few kind of thing. Austerity has absolutely blighted a huge amount of things across this city. It's unprecedented. I mean, being a local ward councillor, 2021 budget is going to be an absolute cliffhanger. Yeah. It really is. And we're getting into the conversations now where the only things that are physically possibly left to do are statutory functions, which you have to do in law. Everything else that's around communities and engagement and youth services and all the things that secure a stable society and a stable community and enhance and develop are being stripped out. And it's unbelievable that the Tories are getting away with this. It's absolutely unbelievable, and they should be ashamed of themselves. And people in the cities and the communities that are affecting should, when they get the opportunity, use their vote to make it known that they're not happy with what's going on. And they can do that with whichever political party they want to support. But the way that the Tories are operating this system at this moment in time is not democratic. They're not even turning up in the chambers for votes, which is unheard of. They're not even allowing an opportunity for other parties to put an opinion forward around things that affect us all. Glenfield Heart Unit was an absolute success for the whole city and the county, and showed the solidarity of the people coming together and being able to launch a campaign that was pertinent to many. And it was successful, and it was a brilliant campaign. I think through the democracy within the police, the elected Police and Crime Commissioner is an opportunity for the society and the constituents and those that want to hold the police force to account. That is their way in. Your elected Police and Crime Commissioner, which is Lord Willie Back, he is elected by LLR, and they can use that function, and his role and responsibility is to hold the views of the public and hold the Chief Constable to account for their operational being. So that there are opportunities that exist. How well they're known, how well they're used is questionable. It really is. But there are those networks within policing, and for the commissioner that we've got now, he's one of the most approachable commissioners, I think, in the country in terms of being accessible to hear people and hear their views and opinions and get out there and meet and greet and etc. He does more externally with the communities across the whole of Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland than he actually does behind his desk. He's not a desk operator. He wants to know, he wants to see, he wants to hear, and he will hold the chief to account. I've seen him do it physically.
So if I can respond to a few things that I have been able to pick up by listening very, very intently, more intently than I ordinarily would, perhaps. But I think that a socialist friend here is absolutely right, that obviously we can't discuss the arming of police, which the police say is a response to the terrorist threat, without then discussing terrorism and why that is happening. Now, the first thing to say, and it should be a given, but I think it needs saying anyway, is that there is of course no excuse for terrorism, no excuse whatsoever. But we do need to look at why radicalisation happens, and especially radicalisation of some of our young people in our communities. And I think, the underlying reasons for that are probably manifold, but I think that undoubtedly it's because people feel isolated, they feel left behind, they feel dispossessed from their communities, they don't feel invested in their communities, they don't feel that they have a future, and they perhaps see things online, etc., where they see another way, and a way to feel like they matter. And it's interesting that there's been a big discussion, hasn't there, about how we prevent that, and indeed about the prevent strategy and whether that is effective or not, and whether particular communities feel persecuted by the very strategy which is attempting, in theory, to help ensure that they are protected. Recently at the IAG that I chair, we had and I know that our chair tonight is also involved with an IAG, and that Iris has also had presentation from the folks at Prevent. And I have to say I was more reassured coming out of it than I was going into it, which is not to say that I don't think there aren't problems with Prevent, because I think there are, but it was interesting to learn, and I made this point at the meeting that I was at last night, which I also didn't hear most of, but still get my 2 pennies worth, is that the myths that are perpetuated, if I can say that word, by our media that we have. I personally think, I'm a former journalist myself. I believe absolutely that the media has an important role in holding those in power to account. But what they don't like is that when they are held to account as a media, and as especially in the printed press, a little bit different for broadcasting, which is more tightly regulated. But some of the myths perpetuated about the impact of Prevent have not been helpful in the public discourse about that, and actually end up clouding the potential real problems that there are with Prevent, which we need to look at. I think lots of people, moving away from terrorism, I think lots of people feel left behind in general, and I think we partly saw the outworking of that with the Brexit vote last year, when I think lots of people felt that for once each vote absolutely counted, and I think lots of people who felt left behind voted to leave the EU, not particularly about the issue, actually, in many cases, of the European Union and the benefits or otherwise thereof, but because they felt a plague on the establishment's houses, and we're going to show our frustration by voting for Brexit, even if in the end we're the most harmed by the actual outcomes of what Brexit means. And so I think our politicians at all levels and in all parties, because or certainly in all mainstream parties, in all parties that have had a role in government over the past 20 or so years, maybe since the days of Margaret Thatcher, have all, to a greater or lesser extent, been austerity parties and austerity governments. One thing that I think there's probably a lot that we'd agree on with the three parties represented here tonight. I was going to say four if you include here in a party political role tonight, but yes, so four. Where perhaps myself and certainly our Green Party friend and our Socialist Party friend might diverge is that although I think austerity has gone too far, do I think that we can have kind of a never-ending burden of debt? No, I don't think we can have that, and I think responsible government has to be about ensuring that we manage the books to ensure that we're not just placing debt on future generations. But do I think that whole agenda went too far and that too many services were cut and the NHS stripped back to the bone and education and all the rest of it? Of course, and that is disgraceful. And again, I say that although I know for a fact, speaking to some of the people that were in the coalition government, that our party did actually prevent quite a lot from happening. It could have been even worse, folks. Do I think they could have done more to prevent some of the more harsher cuts from happening? Yes, I think they probably could and probably should have. So that's my response to the bits that I have heard.
There's a couple of things I wanted to say about the kind of calls for accountability. This is quite embarrassing actually, isn't it? About 2008, I ended up talking to some Conservative researcher they were thinking about ways of making the 2010 Police and Crime Act, because in my capacity as a historian of policing, I was kind of in favour of, until 1964, 66, there was a watch committee. The city council ran the police and could hire, fire and direct any member of the police if they wanted to. They had the legal power to do this. And I think that the PCC system was actually good because it made it slightly more democratic than the old police authority system. I still think, given how limited the powers of the PCC are, it's like a kind of you can sack the chief constable or you can appoint a new chief constable. That's pretty much it's do you press the red button or don't you? And then apart from that, you're just a kind of an auditor of the numbers, which is it's a useful function. But personally, I think that if I was calling for a system with a plain sheet of paper, I think that the one in Northern Ireland, where you've got a kind of regional level police force with local proportional representation boards and a strong ombudsman. So stronger than the IPCC currently is in this country. The Northern Ireland Police Ombudsman Office is far better resourced, more operationally independent, and has the confidence of a lot more people. So if you want to make sure that your police accountability really reaches beyond kind of the 70% of the population who generally support the police anyway, to the 30% of the population who you really need to get on your side if you're going to police effectively, the Northern Ireland system is a good one to try and aim for, I think. In terms of there's quite a lot of issues about terrorism. I do think that I could envisage a situation where we end austerity, we're able to kind of rebuild society and deal with some of the crimes of our ordinary decent crime, and we're trying to, have less of a crime with regard to gangs, for example, rebuild the youth service, etc. But terrorism might still be a problem. I think terrorism is more about alienation than it is about poverty. I think, and it's also it's a different sort of threat in that, because I live in your ward, and so it's often, and my kids went to Sparknote, so their PE teacher was murdered, so this isn't something that happens to other people, and there is a problem in the city, and again, keeping guns out of it for as long as we can is a good thing to do, but I'm not altogether sure that the police tactics that work for gang violence or criminal violence that might involve guns or knives are the same tactics as that help you against terrorism. You can use armed police for both sometimes, but you're not necessarily using them in the same way. Essentially, if the problem is terrorism, then the armed police are mainly just sitting there waiting for something to happen, hoping they'll be in the right place at the right time. Whereas if the problem is someone's been seen with a gun, they're being a lot more active, and they are actually responding, or they're there with the house search. So I don't know, that's just sort of responses rather than any kind of massive plan or anything. But yeah, it is a really complicated issue, and I'm not altogether sure there is a magic bullet. Sorry.
So might there be a time when we'll be seeing armed police officers as a matter of course?
I really hope not. I really think that it would be a bad idea, and I think that you want to keep the guns out of sight. But if we must have guns, keep them out of sight, and set the barriers between. So if every time, for example, the cops want to say, I want to carry a gun and be in plain clothes, if every time that happens the Home Secretary's got to sign it themselves, that will limit the number of times that happens to when you really, really need it. So keep those filters against really potentially dangerous events that can kill people, and just keep keep people alive, even horrible tow rag people, keep them alive. Shift towards serious harm reduction in custody as well. And this normally happens, but it doesn't happen as well as it should do. Make sure that custody officers really know, because this is the thing that really distressed me about today's news over Sean Rigg, was that the custody officers were proved to have basically told lies about what they did, and they've got away with it. And so what you want in an ideal world, we'd be able to say to custody officers, if you don't carry out the rules and look in on people who are responsible for their safety, you're going down, and they should have gone down. And
I would agree with that point. I don't want to see all police officers armed. I really don't want to see that, and I hope our society doesn't lead us down that path. I think there's a time, I think there's a place, and I think there's a process that they should have the ability to deploy. But on a day-to-day general policing operational note, I wouldn't like to see armed policing with all officers armed at all.
Just to come back on some of the points that have been raised, in terms of austerity and the debt burden, I don't think it is a case that ending austerity, and indeed austerity never having been implemented, would be a case of passing on a huge debt burden and would have been reliant on sort of Keynesian methods and massive borrowing. I think the fact that since the economic crisis, bankers' bonuses have totalled more than the bailout. I think the revelations of the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers really reveal where the true wealth in society is, and that there is more than enough money to fund and improve public services from the point they were at 2007-2008, and that this was an ideological choice to suit and benefit the interests of the ruling class, the super rich in society. But in terms of alienation, obviously it's not always straightforward. You live in poverty, therefore you feel alienated. But if you have a situation created by austerity where living standards are going to be driven down, and governments do not want to be held accountable, do not want to be made to feel responsible, and do not want their system to be revealed as the sort of ideological perpetrator of those cuts, then it suits them to have a scapegoat. It suits them to create the illusion of some alternative force in society that is driving the cuts. For example, health tourism, that's why the NHS is under strain. Immigrants, that's why it's difficult to get a house on the waiting list, rather than the fact that no housing's being built. Huge cuts are being made to the NHS, and that is the reality of life in Britain today. And so I think it is a combination of that process that has led to increase in alienation from society. But I also don't think it's just something that is at the feet of the national government. I think there are huge amounts that local government could do as well to be fighting austerity. and it's not just a case of accepting the budgets that you're handed by national government. If we think austerity is ideological and is absolutely wrong, then we shouldn't accept it, and we should use everything at our disposal to refuse to implement it and fight back against it. And it's completely legal to set budgets that don't involve making any cuts, that involve using the millions of pounds in the coffers of councils, even if that is not a long-term solution. If you had a guarantee from Jeremy Corbyn that if a Labour government came to power, every penny of that will be handed back to councils from taxation and tackling the super rich, then it'd be absolutely possible for Labour councils not to make cuts in the here and now and build a massive movement against austerity. Imagine what kind of popularity you'd have, not only from people in Leicester, but from your council workers, from all the other staff and service users and workers that would affect. And that's the kind of movement I'm talking about that can undercut the rise of alienation and the sort of rise of crime, not just terrorist attacks, but particularly in Leicester there's been a huge increase in knife crime, that you could also see the arming of police spreading from just used to cover city centre and one-off events to try and tackle the other problems that are going to flow from increasing poverty and desperation in poor communities. And so I understand the points of the fact that the Police and Crime Commissioner is an elected position, but what I'm saying is that I don't think it's anywhere near far enough. And the kind of accountability I'm talking about is not just once every 4 or 5 years has somebody made the right choices on our behalf, but communities actually running their own sort of police services, playing a more active role. And yeah, you might say people are kind of not engaged in the Police and Crime Commissioners at the moment. What reason would you have to expect that people get more involved in running their local police forces if that was introduced? And yeah, if you're working, potentially sort of 48-hour week, then you're not going to have time to get involved in that, and it needs a whole transformation of society, a cutting of the working week with no loss of pay, to allow people to be more involved in the running of their communities and the running of society. And I think that's real democracy, not just having a vote once every 4 years for who's going to run, who's going to sort of hire and fire people, and who's going to run the country. I think we need increased democracy and running of our services and decision making from in all elements of society.
I think if I could just come back on 2 points in regards to the budget. I think the city mayor has done a fantastic job over the past couple of years in raising the profile of Leicester and securing investment into the city, securing jobs through his economic action plan. And in regards to the budget, I think what a lot of people, when we go and have these conversations out with our communities and etc., is the difference between capital budgets and revenue budgets. People really get confused around what you can use what money for and etc. And even in regards to reserves, I mean, setting an illegal budget, and it can be an illegal budget, would only lead to a team from the big smoke coming up and managing your accounts, and they'd have no influence or no understanding of the communities, the city, the areas, the environment, the pros and the cons and etc. They'd run it just literally with a calculator, and that would be much worse for the city. Every penny that's been available to continue services, to keep the momentum of what we've been speaking around, to I guess the underprivileged, the socially deprived, the isolated, the vulnerable, has been paramount to the core principles that we've tried to keep here in the city. And an example that I use over and over and over again is our library service. we're one of only few authorities left in the country that has maintained its full set of a library offer. And the reason for that is not just because it's a library, it's because we know what value it brings in terms of family time, children's development, reading skills, networking, social isolation, etc. So it has a knock-on effect and may bring a bigger burden elsewhere in the system if we were to lose those things. But that's just an example that I use because it's a really good example and one that's important for this city to maintain. And I do take your point actually around the democracy. I mean, the reason that I came into this being is I would see myself as an exception rather than the norm. And my reason for being involved in these environments politically and as a community activist and trying to make change is to make my situation and the way that I was able to come through the system the norm and not the exception. You know, I grew up in an inner city estate. I've lived in Stonygate Ward all my life. I've got peer circles with many different people that I've been to school with and played football with and lived in and around that are doing many different things to me. Some that you probably couldn't put on camera. But that's the world we live in. That's the reality of the world we live in. And my role, what I see in the way that I try and do my day-to-day business, is make me the norm and not the exception. And I do feel like the exception at the minute, and I'm privileged that I am the exception for myself, but I want to make that for everybody. And that's why I think some of the things that we've discussed today are really important and crucial to ensure that we can create those same opportunities for everybody. I think is crucial.
If I can just come back on that, just because it obviously was specifically regarding the budget. I think it is misleading to say that it sort of would be illegal to make a no-cuts budget. There's sort of a lot of documentation about how that could be done perfectly legally. And I think if you go to somebody who has had an experience in the NHS recently, and I think pretty much every person on the street could give you a story about how they have personally or had somebody they know suffer because of the cuts to the NHS staff and services, and say to them that, oh, it's because you don't understand about capital expenditure and ring fencing.
And that's budgets.
Yeah, if you let me finish, please. Then they wouldn't accept that as an excuse, because the reality is that the austerity measures that have taken place are responsible for people's deaths, and it's as black and white as that. And there is absolutely no good excuse for why those services and why the public sector should be facing those cuts when that is the reality of it. And to say that, oh, the commissioners will be sent in and the council will be taken over if we pass a legal, democratic budget that doesn't make any cuts is ridiculous. There's no instances of it ever having happened. And if you had a collective approach in the Labour Party to not just oppose cuts when it came to national elections, but to be actively opposing cuts on the ground, where you empower in local councils and built a campaign across Labour councils across the country, then there wouldn't be physically enough staff, enough people to go in and take over those councils. But also, what would be the response from local communities where they saw that they had gone out of their way to vote for Labour councils specifically because they believed in those policies, they believed in the manifesto of Jeremy Corbyn, and those councillors are being gotten rid of undemocratically by a Tory government that doesn't like them and like what they're doing. And I think that would raise the whole question of, why do we elect local government? Why do we elect local councillors in our cities and counties? And we elect them because we have different areas will have political differences with the national government, and I don't think you've got a strong Tory government at the moment. I think you've got a Tory government that is ridden with crisis, and a campaign to refuse to implement austerity on the ground in practicality would have huge popularity from the public, from public sector workers, but also private sector workers, and could see the government toppled. And I don't think we do have to wait until the next election if we were seeing that kind of action being organised. And in terms of the city mayor, I think you're maybe the only person I've ever met who has thought that he has played a good role in Leicester. In terms of democracy, it's an absolute abomination to democracy to have a position which controls 2/3 of the council's decision, where somebody who plays a role in deciding who is selected to be council, to have councillor positions, then has a 2/3 vote, and you would need a 2/3 vote of other councillors to overturn the mayor's decisions. And the jobs that have been brought into Leicester, what kind of jobs are they? They're jobs on zero contracts, on poverty wages. The money that's spent on the city centre to look nice is to attract big business, while the estates around Leicester are falling into disrepair, and local children's services and other services are being cut. I don't think anybody who lives in Leicester and relies on those services would say that has been a kind of like wise choice in the spending of money in Leicester. And I'd personally like to see us not have a mayoral system and have a more democratic system.
Thank you. So, in terms of, I think there's no doubt about the fact that, the irony is, almost arguing against myself earlier on, saying that, I don't think we can just keep burdening debt upon future generations, and I think that's right. The irony is that certainly the last time I checked, despite the austerity agenda, the debt had continued to grow. So that rather makes you question, how effective austerity at any level actually is. And the truth is, it probably isn't. Of course, it's right to say that money has to be spent, and the Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner is absolutely right to say that public money should always be spent wisely, and our elected politicians in government, in authority at whatever level, need to ensure that money is spent wisely and in the public interest. But having said that, I think, to be blatantly frank, for the Tories, it's their ideology that they are against the state, and that they'll do what they can to draw the state down and to have a situation where the private sector is doing more and more and the public sector is doing less and less. And of course, when that happens, those that are rich and powerful are fine, because they tend not to use the public sector very much, if at all. And those that are hit are the poorest and most vulnerable. And that is why I think we need more representative politics. It's difficult to get that, though, when it's so difficult for people from the working class and others to get a foothold in politics, certainly at a national level. So I think we need politics to be more representative. I think we need the police to be more representative, and I know that there's been significant work in Leicestershire and elsewhere to try and ensure that is the case. In terms of the police being more democratic, I think anyone or any group of people in positions of power need to be held to account, and that certainly must include the higher hierarchy of the police. It has to be said that my party was against, and I think officially still is. I was checking earlier today, the actual role of Police and Crime Commissioner. We didn't stand first time round. We did the last time round because we felt, this role is here now, and Lib Dem should be standing in every election that's held, and so we stood. But I think it is still our party policy that there's better ways to do that than having one person effectively, albeit that they have deputies and all the rest of it, but effectively having one person holding the police to account on behalf of the public, and so I think there's an argument to be had about that, and it'll be interesting. I mean, I don't know if any work has been done in terms of looking at how effective that role has been, not just here in Leicestershire and Rutland, but nationwide as well. But if it hasn't, I think we do need to look at that and ensure that public money is being spent wisely, and if not, maybe reflect on that. And just one final point from me. I mean, one of the other hats that I wear is that I campaign for reinvestment in youth services, in the youth service across the country. And the youth service, is one of those services that, because it's not statutory, it's my party's policy, and I know this because I was the one who authored it and took it through my party's conference, so I know that it's our policy, that the youth service, the funding of the youth service should be a statutory requirement of councils. And I know that councils in turn, no doubt quite rightly, blame the budget that is handed down to them from central government for the reason why they cut the youth service. And I know that in Leicester, the city council, I don't know if it's happened yet, because I know there's been quite a row about it, but there was the proposal of a further, I think, £1 million cut to the youth service in Leicester. And the reason why I think that's such, to put it at its politest, a daft and silly thing to do is because it's a false economy. It may help your bottom line for a very short period of time, but actually what you're doing, when you take away the services that a lot of our most vulnerable and impressionable young people have relied on, is that they end up having to use other services, whether that be the NHS, whether that be, sadly, down the road, the criminal justice system. And it's because, youth work used to be a really respected profession. And it's not. It's become people thinking, it's just, down the church hall playing ping pong. Well, no, that's not youth work. Youth work is about professional youth workers building relationships with young people, being there for them when they've got problems, spotting. I mean, it's interesting that talking about terrorism. I mean, I remember hearing that the first person to, the Manchester bombing. So the person who did that, the first person to report that there might be something a bit awry with this individual was a local youth worker in Manchester, who was, from what I gather, basically ignored. And it's interesting as well, I don't know if any of you saw, and it's worth catching on YouTube if you didn't, the Jon Snow, Jon Snow, Channel 4 News, his speech to the Edinburgh Television Festival a couple of months ago. And I sat here watching it and thinking, this is a speech that could be made by a Lib Dem, but I don't want to impugn his, his personal politics. But he talked about the fact that, it was following the Grenfell Tower situation, dreadful situation, and boy, if ever a group of people were let down by every level of government, it was them. I mean, just appalling. And he said that he'd never, as a TV reporter, been up a high block of flats, a high-rise block of flats. He said the only time he'd ever done that was as a youth worker, and so I think youth workers are more than just what people think. They are integral to building a good society, and so if there's one piece of austerity that I'd want to cut, want to see reversed as well as all the others, it is reinvesting in our youth service.
Yeah, I haven't really got a lot to add. I think that we've kind of gone interestingly off the point, and maybe I have got opinions about the best governance structure of the city and about should we have a no cuts budget, and if so, how. But maybe that's time for another discussion. So I'll leave it there as far as I'm concerned.
I'd just say I think if there's one thing we definitely have all agreed on today, that austerity is killing our communities, and killing our cities and killing our families, and literally to some extent within the NHS, and I think that's obvious that we're all very concerned around that, and we have kind of have gone off the point, but it does bring it back to in regards to the armed policing. You know, if you have societies that don't feel valued and don't feel welcomed and don't feel part or integral to the society in which they live, then it will inevitably lead to troubles, and that's where the policing impact comes into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a broad discussion, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's gone off topic, because I do think that discussing the social context for the increase in armed police and the events that they're responding to is a result of the society we live in, and not, when we're talking about austerity, it's not just in terms of how people's living standards have dropped, but it's also in terms of the cuts to the police themselves, the huge swelling of the prison population at the same time as cuts to prisons, you know, both in terms of numerically prison officers, but also in wages of workers that work in that sector, but also rehabilitation services, and the fact that people who go into the sort of prison service and the criminal justice system aren't supported. The services don't exist to really bring them back into society and actually prevent crime. And I think that's what the question has to be at the end of the day, not just do we have armed police or not, but how do we get rid of a situation where we would require an armed response to something, and that involves addressing those issues as well.
Yeah, sorry, one more little point, because the number of people who've committed acts of terrorism who were recruited or radicalised in prison is actually quite large. And if we wanted to spend cash on counter-terrorism, making sure that prisons are properly funded would be one good way of doing it.
March, we actually had the chief constable here talking about the deployment of guns at events. It was a larger audience, but it actually was about the police's response. We've also had the police speak to the university on police in a multicultural city. This is about getting the politicians' view, and so therefore I think going off beat and coming back actually is about what politics is about, and so it makes perfect sense for us to be covering it from all the angles that you guys have done, and to that end I'll say thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, Alex. Cheers, Ambrose.
Enjoyed that.
Yeah, actually I enjoyed listening.
Can I also